Hello cruise bikers, this is Robert, and today we're going to be building the new 2022 Cruise Bike Q45. Without further ado, once you have your box open, we'll do an unload here. We're going to have the seat pad and cushion cover. The seat, we'll get into more of that later. We have a new seat we're introducing on this bike. Also, we'll have our parts box, and the complete section of the bike will lift right up and out of the box. You can move that box out of the way and stand the bike right here, strip off all the packaging. Now it's important to make sure the end caps of the hubs are not lost in the packaging. Check on all the wheels on both sides and make sure the end caps are there. You'll also have a tool kit, either one like this or our newer one, which comes in a small pouch and has all the tools you need. I highly recommend, if you have your own larger version of these tools, to use them. Now for this build, we're going to be using our wheel stand. It makes building the bike a lot easier. Let's check open our parts box here. I'm going to open this up, make sure we have our cable end. That'll end up going on the derailleur once we string that later on. Make sure to take that off and keep it handy. Once you open the parts box, you will find inside we have all the rest of the parts we needed. We have the Velcro for the seat. We have various brackets. Those are for the seat base and the seat back. I want to unwrap all of these brackets. Note there are a bracket or two in here we don't need. We'll get that to later. We have our pedals. We have our drive through axle. And note we have the tool that slides inside the axle itself, used to tighten and loosen the through axle. We have our various skewers for the seat. We'll get to that. Our seat bracket. Our rear derailleur, which we'll adjust later. And we have some various hardware packages, chain and quick release, and a little shock notice. Now we can work on taking off all the packaging, undo the handlebars, all the miscellaneous packaging. Now take note on the pivot clamp here, we have our washers and our slide bolt. There's going to be a total of 3 washers. They all go on the outside. We'll cover that in assembly. And once we have all of our packaging off, we're going to take a look at our frame. Very nice. Now note that the fender bracket is pre-installed. Kickstand is pre-installed. We also have our fender mounts. Now one is just a threaded tap into the dropout itself because it's one machined piece. The other one is an insert into the fork leg. So they look a little different, but don't worry, that's normal. Now later in assembly, we're going to be tightening up our clamps and making sure everything's aligned. Now you will notice the fork has a stiff movement. This is normal. This is due to the Viscoset headset, which it feels very stiff. It feels like it's over tight, but it is normal. We don't want to adjust that. That's the way it should feel. Also note we have our seat tube here. Goes in and out. We'll adjust that later when we put the seat on. Also take note our rear through axle is pre-installed on the frame. We're going to want to unthread that and take that out. We use the same tool that came in your parts box to tighten down the through axle into the exterior nut. There we have everything. Let's get ready to build. We're going to take our rear wheel, we're going to put it in our wheel stand with the rotor on the left in this case. We're going to take our rear through axle. I've pre-greased the through axle, put a little bit of grease on the threads, and we're going to take our tool out of the other axle. It stores in either the front or the back. It has to be out of the axle. Now once we have that in hand, we're going to drop the frame right down onto the wheel. Make sure the rotor is aligned. It might take a little bit of work just to get in there the first time. And once that's the case, we'll get our through axle in there carefully. Don't damage the threads. And once it's lined up, we'll tighten down that axle. And then for the time being, we'll store our tool right there in the axle. Now we're going to repeat with the front. Same thing, we're going to have our axle at the ready, pre-greased, and we will put the front fork right down onto that axle and have that at the ready. Make sure our rotors are aligned and nothing is getting bunched up. Now we'll take a quick moment to undo our brake cables. They're pre-routed, and we're going to just drape those over the side here for when we install our front end. Now we're going to take our chainstay, and I want to pause to go over something really quick with the chainstay clamps. Our new installation has a slight gap front and rear with some O-rings, as you can see. Now these clamps will break when they're over tightened. They only need to be a quarter turn or so past snug with an even gap. The O-rings should prevent you from being able to tighten them all the way down to where the surfaces match, because if you do so, they will break. We have it a little bit loose here just so we can move it slightly. We're going to take our 5mm Allen, and for now we're going to undo the boom clamp, and we're going to take the slider, which is the portion that the handlebar is attached to, and we're going to take it off for now. So we're just dealing with the chainstay and the boom at the moment. Alright, now that we have our slider off, we're going to take our 5mm Allen, and we're just going to undo the sleeve bolt that's going to hold that together to the fork steer tube. Now, when we take this off, there's going to be a total of 3 washers. One of them is on the inside, just for shipping. But what we ultimately want is we want to have one washer on the bolt side, like you can see here, one washer there. And on the other side, which is the sleeve side, we want to have 2 washers, and we want them both to be on the outside. So we're going to move this washer so they're both on the outside. Now if yours came with them both on the outside, that's perfect, but in this case this one had it in the middle. But ultimately we want 2 washers on the sleeve side and 1 on the bolt side, both of them on the outside, not on the inside of the clamp. Otherwise the tube will not clamp properly. Alright, just to be prepared, I'm going to put a little bit of grease on the sleeve bolt. I highly recommend doing this. It's going to make everything a lot easier. Alright, let's get our derailleur on. So we have our mount point and our mount point here on the inside of the chainstay. Using our smallest Allen, we're going to undo this small bolt. Then our derailleur is going to attach right inside that hole and then bolt from the inside. Now it only goes one way, so once it sits in there like that, then we can tighten that screw down, being very careful not to overdo it. We don't want to strip out the head of the bolt, and then we will have our derailleur attached to the chainstay. Now once that's on there, we can very carefully position this chainstay on the outside of the fork, and using our drive through axle, Go right there from the outside all the way through, making sure everything is lined up. Again, being careful not to damage the threads of the axle. And once everything's lined up, we're going to use our little tool to tighten that through axle. Now to freeze this front end in place, we're going to set the boom so the crank is roughly right at the same height as the wheel. We're kind of in that like 230 position, kind of with the cranks right in line with the top of the wheel and the front. We're going to tighten that down, making sure everything stays nice in place. That'll make installing the slider much easier. Alright, now before we tackle the slider, we have to make sure that the top part of the pivot clamp that attaches to the steer tube is completely in line with everything else. Everything has to be lined up. This one is a little bit off to the right, so what we're going to do is we're going to loosen our top cap, and we're going to turn the pivot clamp. We're going to line it up with the head tube and with the chain stay, make sure everything's nice and square. Then we're going to tighten our bolts with the 5. And then, if everything's lined up, once we install our slider, our pivot clamp holes will line up nicely, and our slightly greased slider pinch bolt with 2 washers on the sleeve should slide easily through the clamp, through the bottom part, and then the other bolt with 1 washer goes on the other side. And then you use 2 5mm Allen wrenches to tighten the clamp. Now for right now, we're just going to do a preliminary setting, make sure that this is nice and level in advance. That way our handlebars are nice and straight. Gonna make sure that's nice and level. Sight down the side. Now once we have that set, we can just do a preliminary tightening, leaving roughly maybe anywhere from 9 to 10 inches of tube on the back side of the pivot clamp. We'll go over the fit later. And we'll snug these down temporarily, as well as we will tighten down the boom clamp. Now a little note on the boom clamp. The boom clamp needs to be flush with the end of the slider tube, all the way to the end. If that clamp is not flush with the end, it will not properly clamp down on the boom. So make sure that that clamp is flush with the end of the tube. Now we'll take our brake cables and route them right in between front and rear. And now we can attach our handlebars. So we use our 4mm Allen, undo the handlebar clamps. Now again, when you tighten these, there should be an even gap top and bottom. Going to install our bars, making sure that the grip section is swept forward. So you should be able to see the Cruise Bike logo. And once that logo is centered in between the clamps, we will tighten the 4mm bolts. Again, I put a little bit of grease on these bolt heads. Now the first thing we're going to do is undo our shift cable, and we're going to route it the same direction. We can either go through the hole on the side of the clamp, but personally I just like to go right straight through in between the clamp. It's easier, you don't have to take the cable ends off. Just follow it right underneath, just like we did the brake cable, and attach the end down in the fork cable stop. Now for shipping, the brake levers and the shifter are turned so it fits in the box. So we're going to use our Allen wrenches to loosen and turn these so our brake levers are facing straight forward, as you can see here. And we'll also loosen the shifter and turn it as well so it's more in line, similar to the brake levers. Once those are in position, we'll turn those, and we want those handlebars to be roughly a similar angle to the head tube. And once we have that, we can snug down the handlebars for now for a preliminary adjustment. Now let's talk about brake cables. So in this case, we're going to have to loosen the brake cable at the pinch bolt, and we don't need to take it off, we just want to loosen it a little bit, so that way we can get a little bit of slack on the cable. We're going to do the same thing for the front. I'm going to take our cable, and the rear goes on the right lever, and we're going to route it right through the slot in the front of the lever, and we're going to take our adjustment and we'll retighten that back down against the lever itself. These are only for pre-tensioning the housing. Now we're going to repeat for the front. The left lever is the front brake. Now we can retighten our pinch bolts. We're going to pre-tension. We're going to get a little pre-tension on this arm before we tighten it back down. Make sure it's nice and snug and give it a feel. We can also check the same situation on the front. Now again, dialing in the disc brakes is an extra step we're not going to cover here, but it's a balance of lever tension and pad depth, which you can see here. You can adjust the depth of the pads. It should be pretty set up from the factory. Now, we need to set our derailleur end limit screws. This is very important to check this before we route the chain. So we want to make sure that the very first jockey wheel of the derailleur lines up with the smallest cog on the cassette. And then same thing when we push the derailleur all the way forward, which we have to move the cage forward to do. We want the cog to line up with the largest cog on the cassette but not go further. Otherwise we will shift our chain right into the spokes. So now in order to make sure these end limit screws are correct, we have two bolts. One of them adjusts the end limit or the travel farthest down into the small cog, and the other one sets the limit so it only goes so far. As we can see here, you can see if I turn this screw, it moves the derailleur back and forth. What we want is we want to adjust that screw so that the cogs line right up. We don't want it to go further, otherwise the chain will shift down into the fork. So what we see here is a nice alignment of the cog with the jockey wheel on the derailleur. This is a very important setting. This sets the indexing for all of your gears. So same thing, we want that jockey wheel when the derailleur is pushed all the way forward. Now again, we got to bend that cage all the way forward, otherwise the travel won't work. But once we pull this cage and we push it forward, we want to make sure those line up. Now if it goes too far, we need to tighten that end limit screw just a little bit and then check it again. And if it doesn't go far enough, then we need to loosen it and check it again until the derailleur stops right where they're lined up. And once we have that set, then we can route our cable, put our small section of housing in the cable stops at the fork and in the derailleur. And unlike last year, our derailleur here has a real easy cable routing. We want to pull on that cable and make sure our shifter is shifted all the way into the high gear before we attach our cable at the pinch bolt. And there's a small arrow on the back of the derailleur indicating where that cable should go. I'm going to give it a nice snug pull, make sure everything is tight. Make sure we're not shifted into a gear already, and then tighten that pinch bolt. Now again, if you have any questions or if you have any hesitancy about setting things like brakes and derailleur cables, I highly recommend that you do a fine tune once you're done at a local bike shop. Your local bike mechanic will be able to fine tune the shifting and fine tune the brakes. No problem. These things really need to be adjusted properly to be in good working order. Now later, if you have to take up a little bit of cable slack for your shifting, that's when we use our adjuster here at the shifter. Alright, now we're ready for some chain install. So here we have our quick links. We want to have our quick link handy and our chain. The chain is really easy to install. We're going to simply make sure we have our quick link in hand. Now with our quick link in hand, we're going to take our chain, we're going to drape it over the chain ring around the smallest cog. Now the important thing is the chain is going to go around the back side of the cog, and then we're going to drop it straight in. We're going to drop it straight down over the jockey wheel. It's very important that we miss the small metal tab. We don't want the chain to go over that tab, so the chain must drop over. And then we're going to go under the lower jockey wheel. Then we have a nice smooth path for the chain. Now the easiest way to attach this quick link is we're going to put one side in one end of the chain, and then on the opposite on the other. We're going to rotate this chain back and around so our quick link is at the top. We're going to preset it. Now if you can't pull it tight initially by hand, we're going to pull the chain around, and we're going to put a little bit of tension on the crank, and it'll pull that quick link right into place. Right now we're going to put our pedals on. I have pre-greased the pedal threads, very important. Now this one has 15 millimeter flats, so you can use a wrench if you want to. One of our tool kits has a small wrench, or you can use a 6 millimeter Allen. I'm going to use an Allen to install. Now the inside of each pedal has stamped with a left and a right, so you'll know which pedal goes on the right side if you're facing forward, and which side goes on the left. So here we have our right pedal. We're going to unclip our pedal washers that should be attached to the crank. Each pedal gets a pedal washer, and once we have that, we can re-thread these pedals back onto the cranks and then tighten them with our Allen wrench, and repeat for the other side. Alright guys, we've made it quite a bit. Now we're going to get to the more intense part of the build, which is assembling our seat. Here we've assembled all the pieces we're going to need. First thing we're going to do is we're going to assemble the seat base. So we have our two lower seat brackets and our connecting bracket. We have our attachment bolts, which I'm going to very lightly pre-grease all these threads. Again, it makes tightening the bolts much easier. The lower bracket goes at the bottom. Now again, this only fits one way, so the first thing we're going to do is attach the very back bolts. These are M6 bolts, so they're the slightly bigger bolts in the hardware packet, and each one is going to get a bolt and a washer and a nylock nut. We will then tighten those down, And now to install our brackets, we have two positions, depending on if you want the seat further back or further forward. You can either use the first and third or the second and the fourth holes. And if you use the very back holes, they go on top of the bracket. So we have it like this, or for a flatter seat position, we're going to have them like that. Now for a stock position, I like using the second and fourth hole, so that's where we're going to put them on here. So now these bolts are going to go right through the main bracket and the seat bracket, and the other bracket is going to go on the second set of holes. Using our M6 bolts, washers, and nylock nuts. Once everything's tightened down, we've completed our seat base. Alright, now let's get to the seat back. We have our seat back bracket and hardware. Again, we're going to pre-grease these threads. And then we also have a lower bracket and attachment bolts. The back bracket goes on with 4 M5 bolts and nylock nuts. Tighten that down. And the lower bracket goes on with the bolt heads on the front side of the seat. We'll attach the middle ones first. Once we have that tight, we'll attach the side ones on the upper holes, as you can see here. Because the lower holes attach the seat back to the seat base. So once we have that done, we'll use our last remaining hardware to attach the back to the base. Again, using some bolts and some nylock washers to attach them at the hinge. Once that hardware is secure, we will have completed our seat assembly. Hope you will find our new resin seat to be much more comfortable than the aluminum seat. I certainly have found it to be more comfortable. Alright, now let's install our seat onto the frame. We're going to take 2 skewers that have springs and one without, and then a fourth with springs. And we have our seat bracket that we're going to attach to the seat tube using a skewer that has no springs. We're going to use the middle holes. So the middle holes will give us the good starting position. When we adjust our seat tube, take note we want to have at least about 3 inches or so inside the frame. That's no problem. We're going to always have at least 3 in there. We want to line up our seat bracket. We want to sight down the seat bracket to the lower ones and make sure everything lines up so it's nice and square. We'll do a final adjustment once we attach the seat back. We're going to take this moment too to tighten up our shock skewer. Once we have that, we will reinsert our other quick releases with springs, like that. And then the seat base goes right on top, allowing us to tighten those quick releases, making sure that they're all the way down. Make sure the seat base is all the way down when you tighten those quick releases. And then the seat back, we want at a nice 90-degree angle. I recommend using the lower holes. If you're taller, you can use the upper holes. But the point of that bigger bracket is to spread the load a little bit more on the seat back. But once we have that at a nice 90-degree angle, straight out like this, we don't want to have it at too acute of an angle. If we want more seat recline or less, we can change the angle using the different holes in the seat back. Now this bracket is the old bracket. We're not going to use this bracket on this seat. You certainly can if you want to, but it was included. It's not necessary, so this one can just go in your spare parts drawer. Alright, let's attach the pad. So now we have our Velcro strips that came in our parts box. Once you attach this Velcro to the seat, it's very hard to get off, so we're going to make sure we do the base first, and then we're going to do the backs at the end. So we're going to attach 2 pieces of Velcro on the lower part of the seat pad, like that. And then we're going to remove the sticky backing after a quick test fit. Like that. Now you get one shot at this, so make sure that the seat cushion is right up against the front lip. We're going to press down, and now for the back, we're going to want to avoid this trough. The trough is great for your back because it makes your spine rest kind of inside the back of the seat, but I like to avoid kind of having the Velcro sit inside there, so I'm just going to cut each piece in half. And then once I put that Velcro on the pad, I'm going to leave a gap at the back. So the Velcro is only on either side of the trough, keeping it nice and clean. So we have about 1.5 inches or so gap between the Velcro when we stick it on here. Otherwise you just wind up with a sticky piece of Velcro floating in midair. Once that's stuck on there, our seat pad is installed. Now we're going to do a preliminary sit down on our bike here. Going to check our fit. These bars are nice and level. Our seat distance looks good. Our crank distance looks good. At the dead spot, I have a nice slight bend to my leg. On the top of the pedal stroke, I have a lot of room. These handlebars can actually go forward. So normally I would move the slider forward more, so I have a little bit more room at my chest for the bars. Now we have other fit videos. I highly recommend you watch those to get a fine-tuned fit on your bike. Kickstand's pre-installed. Now when you deploy the kickstand, you have to have the front of the bike turned around so it rests on the stand. Alright, carrying gear. Let's install our rack. This is an extra bonus on this particular video, but I figured I would cover it here. A lot of people buy the rack with the bike. Once the rack is assembled, the rack simply installs at the upper mount for the shock. So we're going to remove that quick release that's long on purpose for the rack, reinsert it, then the upper struts are going to attach to the threaded holes at the top of the seat tube. Once we install those bolts, we will level up our rack, tighten down everything, make sure everything is aligned, and snug the top bolts, making sure there's a nice even spacing there, and also the side bolts, and then we will have an installed rack on our bike. Made it this far, so now it's coffee time. Coffee time with Robert. Now, I'm going to use this moment, one, to enjoy these cookies and my coffee, but also just to kind of a couple little reminders. A couple things you want to make sure before you do your rides. We want to make sure our through axles are nice and tight. Got to remember that. Also make sure our pivot clamps are snug but not over tight. Our chainstay clamps, remember to not crush those washers, those O-rings that are inside there. We want to make sure they're snug but not over tight so we can avoid breaking our chainstay clamps. Let's see what else. We want to make sure that we're not over tightening our boom clamp, making sure it's slid all the way forward against the end of the slider so we're getting proper clamping force against the boom. We want to make sure our quick release lever at the shock is nice and snug. We want to make sure our seat tube is inserted about 3 inches or 4 inches inside the frame. That's easy to accomplish as long as we make sure our seat bracket that comes off the seat back is at about a 90-degree angle. That will allow us to have plenty of seat tube inside the frame. We want to make sure our quick release levers that attach to the seat base to the frame are nice and secure. We want to make sure our quick release lever at the seat back is also nice and secure before we ride. We also want to make sure that our derailleur end limit screws are attached before we install our chain. And again, as far as adjusting your shifting and your brakes, if you have any questions at all, please make sure you have a local bike shop examine your bike to fine-tune any of those safety attachments like your brake and your shifting cables. All right, thank you so much for watching. If you have questions, please email us at support@cruisebike.com. I hope you have happy riding. Robert out.